Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our next episode of Big Data Talks, in which we have conversations with industry experts about the way in which data, machine learning, and artificial intelligence are changing the way we live. My name is jan-willem, and I will be your host today. I'm the author of the Enterprise Big Data Framework, which is hosting this series of Big Data Talks. You can always watch back the recording of this discussion on the YouTube platform, the Big Data Framework website, and the podcasting platforms on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Today, I have the great pleasure to welcome Edosa Odaro. Edosa stands as a leading force in the cross-industry domain of AI and data value transformation, steering numerous international organizations towards remarkable achievement. Leveraging advanced data analytics, innovative recombinant methods, and value-driven intelligent interventions, he has played a pivotal role in delivering significant impacts. With a robust background as a Chief Data Analytics and Privacy Officer, Edosa also lends his expertise as a non-executive director on select boards, shaping strategic decisions. Beyond his academic accomplishments in economics, computer science, and business, he is a seasoned professional, guest lecturer, and speaker. He's also the distinguished author of several books, namely Make Data Work, as well as Value-Driven Data. His insights and expertise has earned him multiple accolades, including the prestigious title of Financial Times Top 100 Most Influential Leader and Global 100 Data Activator. Edosa, you can imagine why it's such a pleasure for me to have you on this podcast today. All the things you talk about are so much in line with what we're trying to discuss during these episodes. Welcome to this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So before we dive into all the amazing work that you're doing, I'm always very interested to learn a little bit on what made people enter into this path of data. What was your journey, and did you become interested and a little bit fascinated by that in the first place?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I think data-wise, I think for me, it was a bit of a, in one way, a bit of a no-brainer because as a young child, I was always kind of inclined towards mathematics in some ways. I like logic, I liked Lego, I liked puzzles and things like that. But also, I would say that, so a couple more things. I was very, very keen to just create impact. It was always something that I wanted to see problems solved, right? I just wanted to see that, things were tangible, solved for people. But I think the third thing for me was that I always had this question I wasn't satisfied with just that's the way things are. I had this question in mind, this inquisitive mind. So I think those three things really always kind of led me towards, the path that I'm now kind of taking. So it almost feels like a logical path for me, and that's how I've got into data. And actually, these three things have actually kept me there as well over the years.
Well, I think especially if you're into the logic and the mathematics, then there's probably not a better place where you can be these days. So can you tell us a little bit around your path, around what are the things that you've done over the years, and how did you end up doing the work that you're doing today?
Yeah, I think so. When I first started, a very technical sort of background, first degree in computer science and economics. I've done business innovation and international technology management. I've done, a very fairly technical sort of degrees and academically quite technically sort of minded. But I think that as I've come into and literally doing coding and delivering data solutions, there was always this thing. It just felt like there was a gap, especially in the early days, because I've been doing this for a few years now, over 25 years. And it just felt like there's just a gap, if you like, in understanding and communication between those people who produce data solutions and those people who consume it. So if you like, people talk about technology and the business. So my path has kind of transitioned from writing code and delivering those specific solutions to making sure that value is received by those who actually consume those end products. So that's been my path, and going through that path, I've come through a number of industries. It's been very, very diverse in my experience, over 35 different organizations in almost every different sector. Finance and insurance and banking, government, multilat, name it really. And I feel like I've kind of been there. So I've been very fortunate over the years.
Very, very interesting. And then there's a moment, and I've always wondered what that moment is, that people decide, well, I'm not just going to do the work and specialize, but I'm going to write a book and share some of that knowledge with other people around the world. I'm always very interested to learn is, what is that moment that you realize, okay, let's write this down because I think it can bring some value.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think for me, there was probably a number of moments pushing me towards it, right? One of the things that I've done over the years is I've done a lot of speaking. I've been invited to speak. I've been very fortunate to go to conferences and things like that. And you just find that at workplaces, like I said, I've been in a variety of sectors. The same kinds of problems are recurring all the time. But then you go even outside of that, I think, speaking to other leaders, speaking to other technologists, speaking to other data people, business people, and they're having the same problems as well. And you're thinking, okay, so it's not just me then, right? This is something that's ubiquitous, it's out there. And on the other hand, I'm finding that, okay, so when I'm meeting and seeing these problems within organizations, I'm finding that if you do X, Y, and Z, there's certain types of things, certain types of techniques that actually yield positive outcomes and positive results. So I then decided, look, I need to do something about this. So on the one hand, I'm delivering all this, solutions, help it. I think I've probably helped 250 odd, senior leaders deliver really, really significant outcomes and millions of dollars in the strategies, across data and AI. But there's only so much you can do, right? As an individual. So I thought, that how do I do two things? How do I increase the impact, and how do I scale that? And I thought, okay, look, I'm going to write a book, because that can, is something that can actually scale. It can go beyond those points that I can individually touch. So that was the reason.
Very interesting. We're going to talk about your book obviously in a second, but then my next question of interest, and the reason I'm asking is because I just went through this process as well. Then you get started, and it's writing, rewriting, trying to find an editor that's willing to believe in you and basically publish your material. How did you experience that journey of writing it yourself? And did you have any kind of strategy in writing it? Did you go in the woods and write it somewhere remote, or did you go every few pages a day? What has been your approach?
Yeah, goodness, to be honest, I was written twice now, at least a couple of books. So I think the process, or the whole journey in the first, is a little bit different than the second. I think in the first one, it was just, for me, my mission was just, could I actually do this? That's the question I'm asking myself, right? I've written lots of articles, I've done lots of small bits, right? But I'd never actually taken something from start to finish and written an actual book. So there was a question around, can I even do this thing? Can I write a book?
Yeah.
And so that focus was an initial thing. And it was only after actually managing to put this together that I thought, okay, so now what do we do with publishing it, and what do we do with editing it? So it was kind of the other way around.
Yes. Okay, so you first finished it, and then you went to look for publishing.
Yeah, because at the time I didn't actually know that I could do it, so I just wanted to make sure that I could actually write the book.
Oh, that's
But it was fascinating. A really interesting journey. I mean, in terms of the logistics of doing it, like I say, do you go, out and go into the woods? There's a number of strategies. I personally, in terms of the actual writing process in itself, it was really about recounting physical and tangible things because it's nonfiction. It's actually physical experiences. So I would play all sorts of memory tricks. I would write notes. I would, use digital notes. I would use messages. I'll write little scripts, or all sorts of things, and then at some point look to bring all of that together. So it was a very interesting experience, especially so given I'd never done it before for the first book.
Absolutely, and it kind of gives you the when it's finished, it I think it gives a major confidence boost that you could do it because it's now there and it's published. So you've
Absolutely.
written two titles in the or two titles that are prominently at the top of the list, which are making data work and value driven data. So for everyone who might not have any idea what those books are about, could you give like a 2 minute overview of what the essence of those books discuss?
Hmm. Yeah, I think making data work is a very interesting book because what I was trying to do there was really to talk about what is it that are these big challenges that we face, right? And it took quite two very, very different sort of lenses into challenges. One lens is your kind of day to day. If you're in a business, in technology, in data, those kinds of things that are, if you like, causing stresses and causing frictions, and in your data flows. Everything from when do you get the data to how does it flow into production and how does it work in operations, and those kinds of things, and why is it happening, right? What are the key things? But the other thing, the other side of it, which is, if you like, the other extreme, is looking at data from a worldview standpoint. I was very fortunate to have been in some pivotal sort of situations in organizations, including, for instance, the financial crisis, and being involved in how data actually impacts on whether you can get money out of a cash machine, or whether a bank would survive, or whether it can interact with others across a financial system. So looking at this very interesting, very different, if you like, perspectives, but actually finding that the problems and some of the situations that cause these things are actually very similar. So it was, doing all that research. I'd done some research in my postgrads as well into this, into how data can be, pivotal to life in general, if you like. It's quite a big thing to be saying. So it was looking at that perspective, but then looking at, okay, so what are the things you need to do to resolve those challenges, and then setting out towards the end of the book, book one, making data work, some key principles then that I found over the years have actually helped to resolve some of these challenges. So it's quite an interesting sort of journey, if you like, taking it from really practical day to day. Here's how it's impacting us. Here's how it's impacting in organizations. Here are the sort of issues, and then here are some things that actually get you moving.
Sounds very interesting. So you mentioned a number of principles that can help people on that journey. Could you give a small or brief example of one of those principles on what would be the way in which that could help organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's, I suppose, two elements to that. One of them is an element really around, if you like, change in general, and another is really around the sort of technical architecture that sort of needs to sit alongside that change. So if you start with the premise that most of the fundamental problems are around friction, whether those frictions are about people frictions or tech frictions or data frictions that are slowing things down, slowing interaction, slowing people getting together, slowing change from happening, then it's really how do you attack those things. So in terms of principles for the change side, I think I like to recommend, one of the things I recommend is using something I call the three R's.
Okay.
So the first is like a three-step process or three ways of looking at a change situation. And one of them is, the first one is to say, look, you need to restate. So when you're trying to change something, you need to reset what it is that you actually, what a new world look like, and be very clear about that. And the second is really about, if you're going to do something different, it means that you're probably going to have to reverse things that were there before. So what are those things, if you like, the kind of, stop, start, continue mindset, if you like? What are those things you
Yeah.
have to then actually physically change, right? And I've really been clear about those. And I think the third thing, which I found absolutely fascinating in terms of my personal experiences as well, is really focusing on reward, which is like the third R,
Yeah.
because the trouble is, if you are changing certain things, but actually you're still rewarding the things in the old world, it sounds like a no-brainer, but actually I've seen this happen lots and lots of times. That you have KPIs that are focusing on things that were relevant in the old days. You're trying to make a change. You haven't looked at those KPIs and actually looked at how do we shift them, right?
Yeah.
So it's
Oh,
really looking
I
at these
could
three things.
even take that even broader than just organizations. And as if you look
Yeah.
at how the world is operating, there's still a lot of focus on, I would say, older behaviors in that regard. So I think that's very in line with what you're saying. Should I look at it that way?
Absolutely, absolutely, and and that's the trouble, is sometimes what we're not looking at is what is incentivizing, what's actually underpinning the world as it stands today. I mean, I can go into a lot of things, including like sort of game theory and things like that. I mean, it would really ultimately, the state of play at a moment in time is actually, if you like, a bucket of incentives. Is what
Yeah.
is actually moving people or moving things in a certain direction. And it's going back to those things and saying, what are they? How do we reverse them? And how do we start to reward the new things we're trying to drive towards?
To me, that sounds like a very difficult challenge. So if I were to be like, I'm an executive, I'm listening right now, said, well, this is really valuable, and I would like to set some new incentives or new rewards. Where do I start?
Yeah, I think, and here we've talked about change. Of course, we haven't talked about the technical
Of course, yeah.
elements around architecture, but I think that really, the first thing you need to do is, I mean, I say the first thing you need to do is to take a step back from it all. And that's where sometimes it's easier to have an external view on things. And I've supported lots of organizations in doing that. Is take a step back from it and really truly listen in to what is actually going on.
Mm.
And one of the things that I find as well is that, a lot of times the real underlying frictions, the things that are stopping change from happening, are and don't come to the surface, right? If you ask people, what is it that is stopping you from doing things, some of the times the reasons people are giving you aren't I suppose, the
Real
real reasons.
reasons, yeah.
Yeah, not the underlying reasons. So it's really going beneath. I call this the concealed concerns. Right? There's some concerns that people talk about, but actually they're almost like excuses. And sometimes it's born out of this resistance, born out of fear. And how do you understand these fears? So it's really digging deep and really, I mean, there's some strategies out there. People talk about the five whys and things like that. But
Sure.
the underlying thing is that you need to get under that and create that sort of environment where that can be understood. And then taking that and really mapping that out into, okay, so how does each one of these things, you know, shift, and how to, what are the things we need to levers we need to pull to make this happen. So that's the approach I've taken, and it's been actually quite successful over
Yeah,
the
I
years.
can imagine because
Almost surprisingly, because I mean, in my studies, actually, there's lots of research around how can cultures change, can organizations change, can behaviors change, and there's schools of thought that say cultures are just to be observed, right? They just don't
Mhm.
change, right? They have a life of their own. And there's another school of thought that says actually there's things you can do to cause change to happen, to cause cultures to change. For instance, you might have heard of the the Smile Factory, the Disney Smile Factory.
Yes,
So it's an
absolutely.
interesting use case around that. And so, you know, really watching this happen in real life and seeing that actually the measures, the things you can do to actually move from point A to point B
Mm.
is fascinating. And I talk about some of these stories also in my first book.
Mm. So then you're going through life. You've written the first book. You're super excited and happy about it. You're telling the world your story. Then there's a moment that you think, well, maybe that's not enough. Let's write a second book, which I already find quite amazing. And that book has become, as we now know it, as the value-driven data. So, what was the motivation that made you think, well, let's write a second book in the first place? And then, obviously, my next question is going to be, what will be in that second publication that wasn't in the first?
Yeah, good questions. Good questions. Look, I tell you that when I wrote that first book, I thought that was it. I thought it has everything. Of course, it's talked about the problems, it's talked about the challenges, it's talked about the frictions, what you're trying to achieve, the speed. Um, but one thing that I've always focused on, anyway, ultimately, is that your ultimate, and that's in some ways how I ended the first book, is that you need to be focused on your ultimate to what end, right? So you're solving all
Mm.
those problems, but you got to be focused on that ultimate to what end. And for me, that ultimate to what end is the value proposition. What is that value you're trying to deliver? And that's the core of the second book. The second book is all about how do you, first of all, identify value propositions.
Okay.
Yeah. And then how do you evaluate them? How do you take them through into production, and how do you monitor them, right? All the way through the whole life cycle. And, the other thing that the book does is really focus again on those things that actually stand between a vision for a certain value proposition, the value itself. And so that's really the focus of the second book and that's why it's value driven data. It's actually in a sense, you know, understanding that data-driven cultures are some things that organizations want to push, and I think they indeed should do that. But it's taking it a step further and saying, beyond data-driven, can we go really to focusing on being value-driven, right? And that's
Can you help
what the
me a
second
little
book
bit
is about.
in understanding that? Because I know value is always a container term. Everyone likes to talk about it. It's kind of like an end result. So how do you define that? Is it more from a financial perspective, or is it more around socioeconomic impact, or what's value in that perception?
You've always covered it yourself, right? Because the one of the biggest problems with value is actually defining it. Is actually what
Mm.
is value. So the sort of simple way to think about value and what people find a lot more tangible is indeed the kind of financial value, right? So it's everything to do with strategies that I'm building out to create more revenue, to grow the business on the one hand, or it's strategies that actually helping you save costs, reduce your operational costs, and your sort of bottom line. Or actually in the middle, if you like, is what I call risk reduction or risk avoidance, which is really about those things that could be cost, but you're not actually, you're averting them by putting certain strategies in place. But there's a whole raft, as you started to mention there, of non-financial value as well.
Yeah.
Is it value, for instance, across ESG measures, or is it brand, equity, things like that, right? So there's a whole raft of things. So value is really, it starts with that definition, right? And it varies from situation to situation, from organization to organization, from use case to use case. So that's part of what you start off actually doing, is defining value from the perspective of the organization or the senior leader that you're looking at.
Yeah, I think that brings up a very interesting point because when, or at least from my personal experience, when I saw that organizations starting using data on a more professional, large scale, it first and foremost started in the more enterprise domain in order to generate sales and better customer insights, better marketing, etc. Whereas in the last few years, I've also seen a lot of a more interest from, I would say, nonprofit, government sectors that define value in a completely different way, as in healthier lives, better education, things like that. And I think that what we're seeing across the world is now more of a movement on how could we use data also for something which is kind of ultimately good for society, generally referred to as data for good. Is that something you're seeing as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, well, a global example of this, that I think, I mean, I don't doesn't actually need any introduction in some ways, is what's happened, of course, with the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
So, I think data for good is so, understood. It's just not.
Yeah,
It's
no,
just it's huge. Of course, don't get me wrong. I mean, I've helped raise millions and millions and deliver, lots and lots of dollars and pounds, delivering strategies, for data and AI. But when you deliver data for good, it's a different kind of perspective. I remember having conversations with people I was trying to bring into one of my roles, in my past life, where actually people are talking about what is going to be important to you in this in this role. And when I explained to them that actually what we're trying to do here is not only really save dollars and pounds, but it's to save lives.
yeah,
How do you put a value on that, right? How do you put a value on something that says, do you know what? Because of this strategy I put in place, you know, you know, 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people actually either have better lives or actually have a life at all. We actually save them from early demise. So it's a fascinating thing, and it's certainly an area that I'm clearly very, very passionate about. So you can probably tell.
absolutely, and that's why I wanted to discuss that, obviously, because I think it's an area that's grossly underrated, and there's still a lot more work that can be done within that area. Building upon that a little bit, as we continue, I follow you on LinkedIn for quite a while now, and I saw you were in New York at the United Nations, giving a talk in the famous building. Can you tell me a little bit around that?
That was a very, 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 very fascinating experience, should I say.
I
It's
can
just been
imagine it must have
it,
been
it it's
overwhelming.
yes, incredible to be, first of all, even to be invited to the conference. So I mean, that was
What was the conference
yeah.
about?
So it was a science conference which focused on really, the SDGs clearly, and I think that's the focus of everything. But specifically, it was looking at how data and AI can positively impact on, if you like, food security,
Okay.
but on the other hand, health as well, and the future of health. And really, the UN has got this program which is really about, creating a new strategy for the future,
Hmm.
which they're trying to put together next year. So all of these conferences, and that's part of the reason why this is so big, are actually trying to pull together. If you think about a lot of conferences, you go in, you have that conversation, you might create some impact, but actually that's kind of the end of it, right? But here,
Absolutely.
what this is trying to do is actually consolidate a number of conferences to pull together what is going to be this, the path for the future almost. So it is a huge deal, and yeah, it's certainly an honor to be there, to be able to make a contribution towards that.
Absolutely. And what was then the focus of obviously I assume you're using the materials that you wrote about earlier in as kind of input, but is it then to help define a specific strategic roadmap, or is it more to kind of provide some of the people there with some inspiration and ideas? What's your why did they invite you, basically?
That's a good question. I think what you find in these kinds of events, and I mean, of course, I'm humbled to have been invited, but you find in this kind of events is that what you're trying to do is really pull together very diverse, sort of ideas. And I was brought in, you know, given my, I suppose again, the variety of experiences that have been in various
Yeah,
different industries, and it's really to say, okay, what are those kinds of use cases we can think about? What are those kinds of ways we can think? Because it was focused really on data and AI,
yeah,
my session, and how can this really, galvanize and accelerate some of the things that the SDGs are trying to achieve. So it was inspiration, absolutely, but it
yeah,
was also how do we make it happen ultimately, right? Because you can talk about the inspiration as much as you want, but again, it almost goes back to the
yeah.
what we talked about in terms of change. How do we pull it all together? How do we get people to collaborate across the world, right?
Yeah.
So
Very
it's really
difficult.
it's quite a huge thing. Yeah.
Yeah. I can imagine, and especially because let me first of all say, it's so nice that you have a platform where multiple countries are really trying to make those next steps. And obviously, there's always difficulties with the collaboration. I think that as long as we're different countries, that the problem is going to stay. But it's good that there are some steps. Um, Over the years, I've seen it, been a part of kind of these sessions as well, and I've seen this both at a governmental level, but also on a, I would say, corporate level. Is that it starts indeed with that awareness and making people familiar, and then the data very clearly shows recommended approaches. So, as you mentioned, you can very clearly show with data that this is the best approach for, let's say, healthcare, or this saves more lives, or this provides better food security. And what I always find fascinating is that even if the data very clearly says A, sometimes people still go direction B. And that's something that is always startling and kind of strange to look at. How do you see that, and why? Because everyone is so convinced around the value of data these days, but we still make a lot of decisions which are counter to the data and the AI that you mentioned. How do you see that?
I did quite like this question, specifically because we started talking a little bit about what is this separation between being data driven and being value
Right.
driven. So
Yeah.
I think that what I've found over the years is actually that there is, as you say, really some almost two schools of thought. There's one school of thought that is data driven, and data says this, so let's do it. There's another which is actually resistant to that, you know, is
Yeah.
resistant to the fact that I'm not just going to follow data, I'm just not going to do it just because data says so, right?
Yeah.
And I think what separates this ultimately, and to my mind, is really value. So rather than follow the data, if you follow the value, then actually you find that this is just something that almost can sit in between and actually galvanize, that kind of focus in
Hmm.
some ways across a number of stakeholders. So knowing that this is the ultimate goal, this is the ultimate thing we're trying to do, and working backwards from value to data, a lot of times is where I find that you can actually make such progress, because then value is the thing that everyone then focuses on.
Absolutely. So the other main topic that I wanted to dive in a little bit more with you is obviously the work that you're doing, especially when it comes towards machine learning, artificial intelligence, some of the newer technologies that we're focusing on. I think I just been to a conference this week, and I couldn't stop counting anymore the number of times that people talked about AI, ChatGPT. There's always, every session there is at least a few references and a few mentions. So it's kind of a testament that this new technology is changing the way that we live, the way that we operate, the way that we work, and also go to sessions. So one of the things that we're trying to do with this podcast is really make people aware around how life is changing because of these new technologies. And so would like to kind of pick your brain around how do you see our world transitioning because of this new technology. And then obviously we can debate if that's a good thing or not. But let's start with the big question: to what extent it's changing?
Look, the world would change significantly. Significantly. Well, I've been saying this for many years, to be honest. I mean, maybe close to 10 years. I've been saying that we need to expect this to happen. Of course, we know about, there's lots of talk already before this, before ChatGPT, about the fourth industrial revolution. And that's part of actually what I was trying to say in book one, which is really about we need to focus more on speed. We need to focus more on removing the frictions that impair speed. And I think that movement is already on, right?
Yeah.
And what we're seeing, is obviously just an evolution in some ways. Of course, a big one. Don't get me wrong.
Very
From
big one.
what we knew as AI to now extending to Gen AI. But I think that that move was already there. This acceleration means that we get there even quicker.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? I think it means a lot of things. I think there will be, unfortunately, winners and losers, right? There will be
Yeah.
so many good things to come out of this, but unfortunately, there's a lot of concerns. And by that, I'm saying that on the good side, you're going to see AI getting into areas that you would not really. Its use cases are almost unlimited for AI, right? But there were
Yeah.
some of them that perhaps you can argue were either not viable or not focused on just because we didn't have the scale and the scope to do it. All of a sudden, and this is something that people may not really be looking at, is that Gen AI is not only Gen AI for writing emails and writing text. Gen AI is also a code generator. It can help you write code and write
Yeah.
AI, right? So when you look at it from that perspective, suddenly you're going to find there's a huge proliferation and of things that can actually be applied, where you can apply AI to industries, for instance, like construction, like if you like travel, like manufacturing, some areas that haven't really applied AI, at scale, at large scale,
Yeah.
would potentially start to do that. But then on the flip side, on the, if you like, negative side, there's
The
going to
dark
be,
side.
on the dark side, there's going to be at least a couple of things there. There's going to be a real shift in labor markets, in jobs.
Yeah.
Let's face it. There's going to be a big acceleration of that. There'll be a difference in jobs that are going to be in demand or needed at all, and of course, that means that some people might lose their jobs,
Sure.
or would need to then obviously transition into new roles and new ways of doing things. But also, with all these great things that happen, unfortunately, great technology doesn't always only land in great hands. There's also risks. There's people, bad actors, who might use this kind of technologies and actually accelerate their activities as well. But
Yeah.
also, there's a risk of scale. When something does go wrong with big technology, with AI and now with Gen AI, you can think that the impact of things going wrong can be even bigger. So I think there's many good things. There's a huge raft of good things that are likely to happen to us, but we also need
Yeah.
to be mindful of the downsides as well.
Absolutely. And at that same conference I was mentioning just now, one of the speakers that was giving a keynote says, well, through these kinds of tools and the fact that we are making them available to all, we slowly start to distinguish the ability to distinguish between what's real and what's fake. And the example he mentioned is, in the old days, you could also make a fake, let's say, photograph or fake picture or fake text, but it would require a lot of effort. So you would need to have serious advanced Photoshop skills, and really, it would take a very, very long time before you could make something as convincing that might fool other people. Whereas with these newer technologies, we're basically putting those tools into everyone's hands. And as you just mentioned, the skill with which people could produce fake photos, disinformation. Let's say, let's use book reviews for a second. And now we're on the topic. I could now write 1,000 fake book reviews within a few minutes. How are we going to deal with that dark side, as we just established, and is that ultimately responsibility of the tech companies that produce these kinds of tools, or is that more something where government starts to or needs to start playing a role? Difficult question.
It's a good question, but a very big one. Look, I think that we need to, this, of course, we're talking about scale here, right? I think that's the big thing that's changed. But we haven't just started to see the dark sides of technology, right? We've had AI for ages, and we've had data for ages, and we've had lots of technology for ages. But so there's lots we can learn from the past. But I think the one thing I would say is that it almost always seems like it's either A or B. It's either tech companies or governments. And I think that's almost the way we've been developing things over the years, right? It almost feels like, for instance, a good example is some regulation that was actually that came out around the same time as blockchain, as an example, which completely contradicted the fundamentals of the technology, right? For instance, one of the principles of being immutability, and on the other hand, there's regulation that comes out that says actually you need to delete things, right? And so I think really what we want to see is a lot more of collaboration between tech and business in creating these policies, because a lot of times what seems to happen is that one is playing catch up against the other, and I don't think it's very helpful, and more so now. Perhaps in the old days we kind of got away with it because things changed a lot slower. It took a lot more time for things to get bedded into society. But today, as you can see with ChatGPT, things are just literally going crazy. I mean, with Gen AI. And I don't think we really have the luxury of time to sort of sit and do things in isolation. So I really think that what needs to happen is much tighter collaboration at a policy level and also implementation. But I think the other side of it as well is that regardless of all of that, as we mentioned, there are bad actors out there that don't fall into this category of let's collaborate. You're not going to find criminals wanting to collaborate with governments and tech companies.
Very few.
So unfortunately, we don't really have that, right? And so what I think we then need to do is really focus again on parts of the things I talk about in terms of value is really around how you monitor things, right? So really, really, more than ever, monitoring is important. And then, if you like, extend that to, okay, I find out things a lot quicker. My identification of things going wrong is a lot smoother, it's a lot slicker. The other side of it, which I also talk about in actually my first book, is how do you reduce the friction so that actually resolution of things is a lot quicker as well, because things will go wrong. Let's face it, we can't avoid that. Yeah, the best case scenario when things do go wrong is how quickly can you bring things back to normal.
Do you see collaboration then as kind of like a way out of this?
I would say yes, collaboration, but I think collaboration itself would be insufficient. I think collaboration and really, really, really focusing on speed via friction reduction, right? Reducing friction in collaboration, but also reducing friction in technology and technology change implementations, right? Because there's one thing, even if we got together quickly and we got to an agreement very quickly, if we cannot implement that change quickly, then we're still, it's still a bit of a
Far
challenge,
behind.
right?
Yeah.
And that's why I talk about these two things kind of a little bit separately, right? Because yes, you want to get people together, you want to get to a point of, and I talk about bringing both alignment and misalignments together, bringing it all together to understand it, right? But ultimately, you need to be able to effect that change, which means that you need to build technologies that are adaptable, flexible, easy to change.
Nice. That's maybe something good to think about over the weekend. So we're almost getting towards the end of our time. I have one final question for you. Suppose that I were to say that your schedule's cleared for the next 3 months. Here's a new book contract. And your third book would be coming out, let's say, a year from now. What would be the topic that you would select, and what would you write about that you think is most relevant for today?
That's a really interesting question, and one that I don't think my wife would like to hear that you've asked me. But I think really, um, you know, the when we look at where we are today, and we look at where the world is just now, one of the big things is really how do you make things accessible? I think awareness,
Mm-hmm.
is a big thing. And what I've done actually in some ways from first to second is really continue to increase that accessibility. So for me, I would almost say that you want to go to a point where people understand, really understand deeply value creation for all, right? And I think that so I'll almost go for value for all as where I go with this, because this goes beyond, if you like, in some ways, data and AI, and actually looks more broadly at society and say, what is the thing that's actually going to be the thing that creates value and reduces, if you like, because it's one thing to create value on one hand, and we've kind of touched on that already here, but actually reducing value destruction is another thing that we need to be very mindful of. So I think I would go for something around along the sort of lines. Let's call it value for all. There you go.
Yeah, I think there's something brewing here. So I think your wife is definitely not going to be happy with me. But if I were you, I would call Kogan Page and say "Value for All." That's the new title.
That's a new title. There you go.
Good, Edosa. It's been an absolute pleasure having you with me here today on Big Data Talks. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. For me, these kinds of sessions always never feel like working, because it's just having a conversation and getting to pick the brains of real industry experts. So it's been an absolute pleasure to have you. Keep spreading the word and doing all the great things that you're doing, because it's truly inspiring, and I will definitely keep following along.
Oh, thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you for having me here. It's been a pleasure and a great conversation. So thank you very much indeed.